Irene Calloway had built Calloway Freight Solutions from a single delivery van and a cell phone. She answered at 2 a.m. into a regional logistics company worth $340 million. She was 58 years old. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and kept a legal pad on her desk at all times, because she did not trust anything she could not write down and cross off. She had started the company in a parking lot in Memphis with $900 in savings, a van that needed new brakes, and a contract she had negotiated herself with a furniture distributor who told her she would not last 6 months. That was 7 years ago. The house in East Memphis sat behind a low stone wall on a corner lot with 2 magnolias in the front yard that had been there longer than she had. 4 bedrooms, a kitchen with a long wooden table she had bought secondhand from a restaurant that closed in 2008 and never replaced because the table worked and working things did not need replacing. Most evenings, she ate alone at one end of it with a plate of food and a stack of invoices. Most evenings, the other end was empty. She had 2 daughters and a son-in-law and a grandson she saw at Christmas, and sometimes Thanksgiving if schedules aligned, which they usually did not. Her older daughter was Claudette. She was 34. She had a title at Calloway Freight that Irene had given her 4 years ago, and that Claudette carried the way people carry things they believe they deserve, which is to say without noticing the weight, because they have never had to put it down. She came to Sunday dinners when she remembered, left early when she felt like it, and called her mother primarily when she needed something signed. Her younger daughter was Renata. She was 30. She had married a man named Fletcher Obie 2 years ago and moved with him to Nashville, where Fletcher was, as he described it, in development. What he meant by this was that he had a podcast with 800 listeners, a YouTube channel with fewer, and a long list of projects that existed entirely as conversations he was having with people who were also having conversations. Renata worked as a dental hygienist 5 days a week to cover the rent while Fletcher developed. She called her mother on Tuesdays, which was the one thing she had done consistently since she was 16. Irene had 1 grandchild. Marcus was 7. He belonged to Claudette and a man named Dion, who was no longer in the picture, which was how Claudette described it, no longer in the picture. As if a person could be cropped out of a life the way you cropped someone out of a photograph. Marcus ate his food carefully and asked questions about everything, and had his grandmother's eyes, dark and measuring, the kind of eyes that watched before they spoke. Irene had been watching for a long time. She watched the way Claudette ran meetings at Calloway Freight, the way she ran Sunday dinners, efficiently, and in the direction she had already decided things should go. She watched the way Fletcher talked about work without doing any, the way certain people talked about discipline without practicing it, fluently and at length. She watched the way Renata covered the rent and answered the phone on Tuesdays and asked about other people before she mentioned herself. She had been watching, and she had been calculating. Her own mother had worked the day shift at a dry cleaning plant in Whitehaven for 19 years. She came home smelling of perchloroethylene, a chemical the plant used and that the EPA had since regulated heavily, though not before her mother's lungs had made their own assessment of it. She died at 62 of a respiratory illness that her doctor called occupational in origin, which was a phrase that meant the job did it and nobody was going to be held accountable for that. Irene was 35 when her mother died. The company was 5 years old. She had not cried at the funeral because she was not a woman who cried in public and because the grief was too large to fit in a ceremony. She kept her mother's work badge in the top drawer of her desk at the office. A small laminated rectangle with a photo of a woman who was 44 in the picture and looked older. Badge number 11147. Irene had looked at it every working day for 23 years. There is a thing that happens in families when one generation claws something out of nothing. The next generation grows up inside that something and cannot feel its edges because they have never stood outside it. They cannot feel the cold because they have never been cold. Irene had read about this. She had lived it from the other direction. As the woman who built the walls and watched her children grow up unable to see them, she was not angry about it. Anger was not a useful instrument, but she had started to think about what she was building toward, and whether the people she was building it for understood what they were receiving. The answer, when she was honest with herself, was no. In March, on a Wednesday evening, Irene called her family to dinner. Not a holiday, not a birthday. A Wednesday. This was unusual enough that Claudette checked her calendar twice before confirming, and Fletcher called Renata from the next room of their apartment to ask if there was something she had forgotten to tell him. They arrived at different times in the way families arrive when they are not truly assembled but merely present in the same location. Claudette came at 6, with Marcus in the back seat, already on his tablet. Fletcher and Renata came at 6:20. Fletcher shook Irene's hand at the door, which was something he always did and that Irene had never commented on, though she had thought about it many times. They ate. The conversation went the way conversations go when the people having them are performing the idea of a family dinner rather than having one. Claudette mentioned a logistics contract she was pursuing. Fletcher mentioned the podcast. Renata asked about the magnolias in the front yard and whether the city had come to trim them yet. Marcus ate everything on his plate and asked if he could have more cornbread. And Irene gave him more cornbread. After dinner, Irene asked Marcus if he would go watch television in the den. He went without arguing, which was characteristic of him. He had his grandmother's judgment about when a room needed him and when it did not. Irene went to the kitchen counter. She came back with 3 envelopes, white, letter-sized. She set one in front of Claudette, one in front of Renata, one in front of Fletcher. Claudette looked at hers and reached for it immediately. Fletcher looked at his and did the thing he always did with information, which was to tilt his head slightly as if angling for better reception. Renata did not reach for hers. She looked at her mother's face. Irene said, "Each envelope has $500 in cash. That is what the 3 of you will have to live on for 30 days, starting Friday morning. Not individually. Together. As a household." The table was quiet. She said, "Your accounts at Calloway Freight are frozen. Claudette, your corporate card is suspended. Fletcher, the monthly transfer I have been making to your joint account is paused. Renata keeps her hygienist income because she earned that herself, and I am not in the business of taking from people what they built. But everything that flows from me stops Friday at midnight." Fletcher said, "Irene, I don't think." She said, "You are not being asked to think about it. You are being asked to live it." Claudette set down the envelope. She had not opened it. She looked at her mother with the expression she used in contract negotiations, composed and assessing, the expression of a woman who was determining which angle of approach would be most efficient. She said, "What is this supposed to prove?" Irene said, "I don't know yet, that's the point." Renata picked up her envelope. She held it without opening it. She looked at the weight of it, which was not much. $500 in mixed bills had less weight than you expected it to. Irene said, "I am 58 years old. I started this company with $900 and a van that needed new brakes. I have been running it for 27 years, and I have not once asked any of you what you would do with it if it were yours. I am asking now, not with words, with 30 days. She stood up. She took the plates to the kitchen. She came back with the cornbread pan and set it in the center of the table in case anyone wanted more. The conversation after that was brief and uncomfortable, the way conversations are brief when the people having them are already thinking about the ones they will have later. In the car, in the apartment in Nashville, behind the closed door of Claudette's house in Midtown Memphis. Irene walked them to the door. She kissed Marcus on the top of his head. He looked up at her and said, "Grandma, are you okay?" she said. "Yes, baby. I'm working on something." He nodded as if this made complete sense, which for him it did. Friday came. Claudette approached it the way she approached everything, with a plan. She had spent Thursday evening making a spreadsheet. 30 days, $500, 3 people, which was $5.55 per person per day. which was not enough, and she knew it and had already begun identifying solutions. She called the head of procurement at Calloway Freight, a man named Sutton who had worked for the company for 11 years and who owed her, in the informal accounting she kept, of professional obligations. At least 2 favors. She said, I need a short-term consulting arrangement. Off the books. 2 weeks. Sutton said, Claudette, I don't know if I can. She said, you can. $1,200 for the 2 weeks. I'll have the deliverable to you by the 15th. The call lasted 4 minutes. She hung up and wrote $200 in the revenue column of her spreadsheet. Then she called a contact at a competing firm and had a similar conversation. Then she called her friend Priscilla, who ran a small marketing agency and who had been asking Claudette for 3 months to do a guest session with her team about operational logistics. By the end of Thursday, Claudette had arranged $3,400 in consulting income for the month. She had not touched the envelope. She had also not told Fletcher or Renata what she was doing. In Nashville, Fletcher and Renata sat on the couch in their apartment with the envelope open on the coffee table in front of them. The bills were sorted into 2 stacks. Renata had done the sorting. She did most organizational tasks in the apartment, not because they had discussed this, but because the tasks had sorted themselves the way tasks sort themselves in households where one person notices them and one does not. Fletcher said, $500 is actually workable if we're strategic. Renata said, we have $1,840 in our joint account. My next paycheck is the 14th. Fletcher said, so we're fine. Renata said, Mom said the money that flows from her stops. You get revenue from the channel? Fletcher was quiet for a moment. The channel had made $214 in ad revenue in the past 6 months. He knew this. He had not said it aloud in some time. He said, I'm going to accelerate some things. Renata looked at him the way she had been looking at him for about 14 months, which was with the expression of a person waiting to see if the sentence would continue into something specific. It did not continue. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and did the math she always did, the quiet arithmetic of a woman who had been holding things together at the seams and had gotten so practiced at it that the seams no longer showed. She was good at her job. She had been at the same practice for 6 years. Her patients trusted her. She had recently been offered a position at a larger practice in Brentwood that paid $11,000 more per year. She had mentioned it to Fletcher twice. He had said, both times, that's great, babe, and then talked about something else. She had not accepted or declined the Brentwood offer. She lay in the dark and thought about her mother at 31, answering a 2 a.m. call from a furniture distributor, alone in a parking lot with a van that needed new brakes, building something because the alternative to building was not building. In Memphis, Claudette moved through the month with the efficiency of a person for whom constraints are simply optimization problems wearing different clothes. She completed the consulting arrangement for Sutton by the 12th, 3 days early, and invoiced the marketing agency by the 17th. She managed the household budget with precision, buying groceries in bulk, meal prepping on Sundays, tracking Marcus's school expenses in a column separate from household costs. By day 18, she had money. She had solved the problem the way she solved all problems, by reconfiguring the parameters until the problem looked like a system she could run. She called her mother on a Tuesday. She said, I want you to know that I've managed the month. I have documentation if you want to see it. Irene said, how? Claudette said, consulting. I had contacts. There was a pause. Irene said, whose contacts? Claudette said, mine. Another pause. Irene said, were any of them people you know because of Calloway Freight? The silence lasted 5 seconds. Claudette was not a woman who let silences last 5 seconds. She said, most of them. Irene said, okay, and did not say anything else for a moment. Then, I'll see you Sunday. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with her hand on the phone and looked out the window at the magnolias. They were budding. It had been a warm March. She thought about what Claudette had done and about whether it was the same as what she herself had done at 31, which was to call everyone she knew and leverage every connection she had. She turned this over in her mind for a long time, and arrived at something she had not expected, which was that the answer was yes and no, and that the distance between the two was a question. She did not know how to ask yet. In Nashville, by day 10, the apartment had begun to feel different. Not smaller, just more visible. The things in it were more visible. The coffee maker that Fletcher had bought because he wanted to learn to make pour-over coffee and had used twice. The guitar in the corner of the bedroom that he had owned for 4 years and could play 3 chords on. The shelf of books about creativity and entrepreneurship and building things, their spines uncracked in the way books go as uncracked when they are purchased as intention rather than read as instruction. Fletcher had, by day 10, made 0 in new revenue. He had recorded 2 podcast episodes and posted them. He had replied to comments. He had spent an afternoon on a document he called a brand strategy that was 14 pages long and contained no action items with deadlines. On day 11, he called his father in Knoxville. His father, a man named Walt, who had worked 30 years in insurance adjusting, said, "What do you need?" Fletcher said, "I don't need anything, Dad. I'm just checking in." His father said, "You sound like you need something." Fletcher said, "Renata's mom froze our accounts. It's this whole. It's complicated." His father said, "How much you need?" Fletcher said, "Dad, I'm not." His father said, "Fletcher, how much?" The call lasted 8 minutes. Afterward, Fletcher sat in the apartment, feeling something he did not have a precise word for, which was the specific feeling of a man who has just been helped by someone he has told himself he no longer needs help from. He did not tell Renata about the call. He told her on day 19, when she found a $400 deposit in their joint account from a contact labeled WOB and asked him about it. She did not say anything for a moment. She set her phone down on the kitchen counter. She picked it up again. She said, "I got a call from the Brentwood practice today." Fletcher said, "Yeah?" She said, "They need an answer by the end of the month." He said, "What did you tell them?" She said, "I told them I'd call back tomorrow." She went to work the next morning and called from the parking lot of the dental practice before she went inside, the way she made important calls, in cars, in parking lots, in the specific privacy of a space that was not home and not work but in between. She accepted the position. She called her mother from the same parking lot. Irene answered on the second ring. Renata said, "I took the Brentwood job." Irene said, "The one you've been sitting on for 3 months?" Renata said, "Yeah." Irene said, "What made you decide?" Renata said, "I think I've been waiting for permission. I don't know from who." The line was quiet, not awkwardly, the way lines go quiet between 2 people who do not need to fill space. Irene said, "Your grandmother asked permission for 19 years and the plant still put chemicals in her lungs." Renata didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "I know." Irene said, "You don't need my permission, baby. But you have it if you want it." On the last day of the month, Irene drove to Nashville. She did not tell anyone she was coming. She arrived at Renata and Fletcher's apartment at 11 in the morning and stood at the door. Fletcher answered. He was in a t-shirt and sweatpants. He was, as far as Irene could tell, in the middle of nothing in particular. He looked at her. She said, "Let's take a walk." They walked to a park 3 blocks from the apartment. It was a Tuesday in early April, cool enough for jackets. The park had a pond with ducks and a path around it that took about 12 minutes to walk. They walked it once without speaking, which for Fletcher required effort that showed on his face in the specific way effort shows on the faces of people who are accustomed to filling silence. On the second loop, Irene said, "Tell me about the brand strategy document." Fletcher looked at her. She said, "Renata mentioned it. 14 pages. He said, "It's a direction. A framework." She said, "Does it have a due date on anything?" He said, "It's more of a. It's directional." She stopped walking. She turned to face him with the directness she used in contract negotiations and had been using since 1997 in rooms full of people who had not expected her to be direct. She said, "Fletcher, I am not your enemy. I did not do this month to prove that you are failing. But I need you to tell me something true. Not directional. True." He looked at the pond. The ducks were moving along the far bank in the unhurried way ducks move when they have no particular destination, he said. I don't know if I have anything to build. The sentence arrived in the air between them and stayed there, Irene said. That is the first true thing you have said in my presence in 2 years. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite shame and not quite relief, but lived in the space between them, she said. Not everyone is supposed to build a company. That is a lie we tell people, and it costs them decades. But everyone is supposed to do something that earns its own weight, something your own hands produce. Not mine. Not your father's. Your, he said. Renata carries most of it, she said. Yes, she does. He said, I've known that, she said. I know you've known. Knowing and changing are two different neighborhoods. They stood by the pond for another few minutes. A child on a tricycle pedaled past on the path behind them. A man threw bread to the ducks, and the ducks moved toward it with the sudden urgency of creatures who had been pretending not to care. Fletcher said, What do I do? She said. That I can't tell you, but I'll say this. Renata accepted a job in Brentwood. It pays more. It's her thing, not yours. The question is whether you're going to build something of your own or keep building around what she's doing. She began walking back toward the apartment. He stood at the pond for a moment longer, then followed. On the drive back to Memphis, Irene stopped at a gas station outside of Jackson and bought a cup of coffee from the dispenser machine, the kind that came out pale and too hot, and sat in the car in the parking lot drinking it. She thought about Claudette and the consulting contacts that were technically her contacts, and whether that was resourcefulness or inheritance wearing a disguise. She had not resolved this. She suspected she would not resolve it quickly. She thought about Renata and the parking lot call and the $11,000 a year that Renata had been leaving on a table for 3 months waiting for something Irene could not name. She thought about Fletcher and the 14-page document and the $400 from his father and the sentence he had said by the pond. I don't know if I have anything to build. She had been in business for 27 years, and she had never once said that sentence, not because it was never true, but because she had never permitted herself to sit long enough to hear it. She did not know if that was strength or specific kind of damage she had never examined. The coffee was bad. She drank it anyway. She got back on I-40 and drove east. 2 weeks after the 30 days ended, Irene called a meeting. Not at the house, at the Calloway freight offices on Shelby Drive, in the small conference room with the long table and the window that looked out onto the loading bays. She had chosen this room specifically. She wanted them to feel where they were. Claudette came in a blazer. Fletcher came with Renata. Marcus, who was with Claudette, sat in the corner with a book and read it without being told to, which was, in Irene's private accounting, the most impressive thing she had witnessed in the past month. Irene stood at the head of the table. She did not use a presentation. She had thought about using a presentation and decided against it because what she wanted to say was not a presentation. It was a decision, and decisions did not need slides. She said, I bought a building. She paused to let this arrive. She said, It's on Chelsea Avenue. It's been empty for 3 years. Before that, it was a dry cleaning plant. The table was quiet, she said. My mother worked in a dry cleaning plant for 19 years. The chemicals they used before regulation gave her a lung disease. She died at 62. I have thought about this every day since. Not to be morbid, because it is true and true things deserve to be thought about, she said. The building is going to be a training and workforce center. Ground floor is hands-on trades, electrical certification, HVAC, logistics operations, real credentials, real jobs at the end. The top 2 floors are going to be transitional housing, 18 units, for people who are employed or in training but cannot afford rent while they get stable, below market, permanently. She stopped. She looked at Claudette. Claudette was looking at the table in a way that meant she was calculating. Not dismissing, calculating. She looked at Renata. Renata had her eyes on the window, on the loading bays outside. She was watching a man move a pallet with a hand truck, slow and deliberate, the way work moves when the person doing it is paying attention. She looked at Fletcher. Fletcher was looking at the table. His hands were flat on the surface open, which was different from how he usually held them. Irene said, "I am not going to tell you who runs it. I am going to tell you what it needs. It needs operations. It needs someone who understands how to build a system from nothing and manage it day to day. It needs someone who understands what people who have been struggling actually need, not what looks good in a grant proposal. And it needs someone who can build the programming, the courses, the job placements, the relationships with employers. That last part is new. Nobody at Calloway Freight knows how to do that." She let the silence hold. Claudette spoke first. She said, "The operational piece I can build, I'd need 6 months and full authority over hiring." It was a competent answer. The kind of answer that solved the infrastructure problem without touching the human one. Renata said quietly, "The dry cleaning plant on Chelsea, the one your mom worked at?" Irene said, "No, a different one. But same model, same era, same exposures." Renata said, "So you're building something in the same place where that kind of harm happened?" Irene said, "Yes." Renata said, "I don't know how to run a workforce program, but I know what it's like to need one and not know where to find it. I know what it's like to take a job because it's available and not because it fits." She paused. She said, 6 years ago, I almost didn't take the hygienist job. I almost went into hospitality management because someone told me I'd be good at it, and I didn't have a better reason not to." She said, "I'd want to talk to the people who would use the program before we build anything. Not to design for them. Just to listen." Irene looked at her younger daughter for a moment. Then she said, "That's what the building needs." Fletcher had not spoken. He was still looking at the table with his hands open on it. Irene said, "Fletcher." He looked up. She said, "I'm not offering you a role." He held her gaze. She said, "But I'll say this. The podcast, the channel. You have been building those alone, without accountability, without deadlines, and you have gotten 800 listeners in 2 years. That is not nothing. But it is also not enough to tell you who you are." She said, "The training center is going to need someone to tell its story, document it, show people what it actually does. Not a grant proposal, the real thing. Week by week, people coming in, what they learn, what changes." She said, "That is content, real content. Earned, if you want to earn it." The room was quiet for a moment. Fletcher said, "You'd let me document it?" She said, "I'd require it, if you take it, which you do not have to." He said, "Why would you trust me with that?" She said, "I don't yet. But Renata has been carrying your weight for 2 years, and she's about to stop, and a man who is honest enough to say he doesn't know if he has anything to build is closer to building something than a man who never asks the question." He looked at the table. His hands were still flat on it, open. He said, "I'd need to learn what I don't know." She said, "Yes, you would." Marcus looked up from his book in the corner. He had been reading, or appearing to read, for the past 20 minutes. He said to no one in particular, "Is this about Grandma's mom?" Everyone looked at him. He said, "The dry cleaning lady. Badge number 1147. Irene looked at her grandson. He had her eyes, dark and measuring, watching before they spoke. She said, "How do you know about that?" He said, "You showed me the badge once. I asked what the number meant, and you said it meant she went to work every day, and that was enough to know." Irene did not respond immediately. She looked at the boy sitting in the corner with a book, who had listened to an entire conversation about workforce development and transitional housing and a building on Chelsea Avenue, and had connected it to a laminated badge in a desk drawer. She said, "Yes. It's about her." Marcus said, "Okay," and looked back at his book. The meeting ended without votes or assignments. Irene walked them to the parking lot. The loading bays were quiet now, the afternoon shift having changed over. The bay doors rolled down. The lot smelled of diesel and asphalt warming in the spring sun. Claudette walked to her car, then turned. She said, "Mom, the consulting clients I used, the contacts from Calloway, I know what you were going to ask on the phone." Irene said, "What was I going to ask?" Claudette said, "Whether it was really mine or whether I was spending your capital and calling it mine." Irene said, "And?" Claudette said, "I don't know. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and I don't have a clean answer. Irene said, "That's a better answer than a clean one." Claudette got in her car. Irene watched her go. She stood in the parking lot until the last car had pulled out onto Shelby Drive. The magnolias in the median were blooming. Memphis in April did this, went from gray to sudden pink, the trees not asking permission. She went back inside. She went to her office. She opened the top drawer of her desk and took out the badge. Badge number 11147. A woman who was 44 in the photograph and looked older. A woman who had gone to work every day for 19 years and asked nothing except to be allowed to keep going. Irene set the badge on her desk in front of her. She had built $340 million. She had built it from the memory of a woman who built nothing in the way the world measures building, but had built Irene completely, had built her from scratch, the way you build things when you have only yourself and your hands, and the knowledge that stopping is not an option because the people behind you are watching. She picked up the badge. She held it the way she always held it, with 2 fingers, carefully, the way you hold things that are not yours to keep, but that you are the one keeping. She put it in her jacket pocket instead of the drawer. She was going to Chelsea Avenue tomorrow. There was a building there that had been empty for 3 years. She wanted to walk it before anyone else did. She wanted to stand in the rooms before the plans were drawn, and the permits were filed, and the decisions were made. She wanted to hear what it said when it was still empty. She turned off her desk lamp. She walked out through the loading bays, past the bay doors rolled down for the evening, past the dock where 27 years ago she had backed in a van that needed new brakes, and handed over her first delivery herself because she could not yet afford to hire anyone to do it for her. The parking lot was empty now. The magnolias in the median had gone dark in the fading light. The city stretched out beyond them, wide and ordinary and full of people going home to whatever they were going home to. Irene Calloway walked to her car. She had something to build. She had always had something to build. The difference now was that she was building it for someone who was not here to see it, and that was the kind of building that did not show up in quarterly reports or on the side of a building, but that held longer than stone because it was made from the specific gravity of a debt you could not pay and would not stop trying to. She got in the car. She drove home. Tomorrow was Chelsea Avenue. The day after that was everything